2025 was a pretty momentous year for geopolitics. And if the first few days of 2026 are anything to go by, this coming year might be even more disruptive and dramatic. To go beyond the noise and identify what mattered most from the last year, I asked each of our program directors what was most significant in their respective parts of the world. But I also did something that think tank analysts typically hate doing. I peer pressured them into saying, on the record, what their boldest prediction is for what's going to happen in the coming year. This was fun to record. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. Okay, so Ryan Berg is the director of our Americas program, and given what has already happened so far this year, we have to start with you. So Ryan, welcome. And I want to start by asking you, what was the most significant development in the Americas last year in 2025?
Thanks, Will. I think the most significant development in 2025 was the inauguration of Donald Trump. He's brought a whole slew of policies towards the Latin America region. But I think most importantly, it's safe to say that this administration is a Latin America first administration. It's focused an incredible amount of its attention on Latin America. It has put in place policymakers that are Latin Americanists at the end of the day in very important policymaking positions, starting, of course, with Secretary of State Rubio, but the Deputy Secretary Landau. We had the NSA position occupied by Mike Waltz for the first 101 days. We had a high-level special envoy, Mauricio Claro-Caron, who's a Latin America specialist. The point is that there are a lot of Latin America people in the administration, and they've brought a lot of focus and attention to the region that, frankly, we're not accustomed to as Latin Americanists. And then to kind of punctuate that point, not just a number of trips that senior cabinet-level officials made to the region throughout the year, but also the year finished, 2025 finished with the release of a national security strategy document that was very heavy on Latin America. It led with Latin America in the regional sections, and not only that, but it gave it 4 pages of treatment. As a longtime Latin America watcher, I think I'm used to 1-page maximum treatment for the Western Hemisphere. This year we got 4. And to conclude, Will, there was the lead of that section talked about a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And this, of course, set off a lot of debate within Washington about whether this was mere bluster or whether this was actual doctrine that would guide the administration's strategy. It seems to me that it's doctrine that's actually guiding the administration's strategy. They have presided since August of 25 over one of the largest naval buildups we've ever seen in the Southern Caribbean. At one point, about 20% of the U.S. Navy's deployed fleet was in the Southcom AOR, and that's not a typical force posture for the United States. And so that has kind of set the stage for the dramatic events that began 2026.
Indeed. And so I imagine maybe when we look forward to this coming year, you probably are going to have an answer or a prediction maybe related to these dramatic events that you're talking about. So what is your boldest prediction for Latin America in 2026?
Indeed. The two questions are connected. And I think I will just say at the outset, I am projecting a little bit of hope here as part of my boldest prediction.
Okay.
But I've always been close to the Venezuelan cause. Look, the United States conducted an incredible operation in the early morning hours of January 3rd to capture Nicolás Maduro and whisk him away to the United States to stand trial for the indictment stemming back to 2020 on drug trafficking charges. That has led to a very complicated situation in Venezuela, where the United States is essentially recognizing the de facto vice president of that country as the interim authorities or the acting president. But there's a roadmap that the administration has talked about, which will involve a stabilization phase, a recovery phase of the economy, and then eventually what Secretary of State refers to as a transition phase. And so my boldest prediction refers to the transition phase of that 3-prong plan. And I think transition refers very clearly to the idea that eventually we need to solve the political legitimacy questions that are left unresolved at the moment with the regime. We need to resolve those questions with elections in Venezuela. Elections that I sincerely hope Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo González Urrutia, and others in the Venezuelan opposition can compete in freely and fairly, so that we have both the questions of political legitimacy and the questions of political stability resolved in Venezuela by the end of this year.
Okay, wow. So the beginning of a transition to democracy in Venezuela.
Indeed. That's my bold prediction for 26.
Yeah, starting with optimism. Let's see if it remains as we go through the rest of the world. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Will.
Next up, we have Europe. And Max Bergman is the director of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program. Max, welcome back.
Great to be here.
I want to start by asking you what you think mattered most in 2025. What was the most significant development in Europe, Russia, or Eurasia?
I think the most significant development is that the responsibility for Ukraine, for backing Ukraine, has been shifted from the United States to Europe, and that the Europeans, in fact, have stepped up. And what happened at the end of the year was that the Europeans, they didn't seize the frozen Russian assets, but they found actually, I think, a better way to go about this. The EU is just borrowing money to keep Ukraine afloat, to invest in Ukraine's military. And that transition has happened. So the fear that we had with Zelensky in the Oval Office in February of 2025, that, oh my God, the US was going to cut off Ukraine and Ukraine would collapse, I think has been abated because the Europeans have stepped up. The other thing they've done is started to buy US weapons to give to Ukraine, basically buy American aid to give to Ukraine, something that was not on the table at all. But the Europeans have gotten there. So Europe, I think, really has stepped up in backing Ukraine and needs to be acknowledged for that.
Great, thank you. So is your prediction then for 2026 also about Ukraine? I want you to be bold.
Well, no, because my bold prediction is the war will be going on into 2027. So I'm not going to make that my prediction. My bold prediction is that Viktor Orban, the current prime minister of Hungary, will not be the leader of an EU country by this time next year. And that gives me a way out. I phrase that very specifically. So Hungary is due to have elections by April. Viktor Orban is currently trailing in the polls quite significantly to Peter Magyar, who is this upstart sort of breakaway figure that is really challenging Orban for all the corruption and is running a really effective sort of political operation. Is approaching 50%, is likely going to win the election. So what I mean here is that Orban is likely to lose the election. But there's a whole other view that Orban can't lose this election. He's building like his Palace of Versailles outside of Budapest. So how does he step down? Hungary's become very corrupt. There's a whole regime effectively in place that would topple. It's not all that different than Maduro and other places. So how does he leave? And I think this is the big question. So if Orban tries to sort of subvert the election, we have something like Belarus or another place, I think the EU will take really strong action, will not allow it. There's Article 7, which could suspend voting rights and potentially move toward evicting Hungary out of the European Union, or at least just suspending Hungary's ability to basically impact the EU at all. And so that I think is something to really watch out for in 2026, really in the first quarter of 2026.
Interesting. Okay, Max, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we're moving to Korea with Victor Cha, the president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, and also our Korea chair, of course. So, Victor, when you think back about 2025, what do you think was the most significant development in Korea?
Probably the most significant development was the agreement reached between the Trump and the Lee Jae-myung governments, the so-called joint fact sheet, which was basically a $350 billion trade and investment framework agreement that also included things like cooperation on shipbuilding between the U.S. and Korea, and even cooperation on nuclear-powered submarines for Korea, in addition to a whole host of other sorts of agreements on trade and in terms of upgrading and modernizing the alliance. So this was, I think, a very big deal. If it's all executed, it will be a major change in the alliance relationship. And of course, this came after a period of 6 months initially when the Trump administration came in and there was no government in Korea because of the impeachment and martial law crisis. So that was probably the biggest event of 2025.
Yeah, quite a politically chaotic start to last year. But now as you look forward to 2026, what is your boldest prediction for South Korea, North Korea? What are you watching out for?
So my boldest prediction would be that Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will meet and that they will try to declare some sort of peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula, which would be very telegenic, and it would get a lot of people writing stories about it, and would be big TV news, which Trump just loves, but which may actually in substance not accomplish much, but would be certainly something watched by everybody. Trump would want to make this the 10th war that he has solved, or the 10th peace that he has created, which I think in his mind would seal the Nobel Peace Prize for him in 2026. And for the North Korean leader, it would be a great way for him to be able to say that he now has relations with not just Xi Jinping, but also Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump.
And so do you expect the South Koreans would play along with that?
I mean, in one sense, I think they would, because this is a progressive government in South Korea, which has taken unusually pro-alliance positions, more so than previous progressive governments. But at the same time, they also want to see peace and reconciliation with North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. So I think it's something that they might also be interested in doing. Of course, everybody would want to see substance behind these political declarations, and that would, of course, be the challenge. And when we're talking about things like denuclearization and getting rid of North Korea's ballistic missiles and nuclear tests and those sorts of things.
Okay, well, that was bold, so thank you. We'll have to see if you're right. Thanks so much, Victor.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we are moving to the first of 3 expert reactions to China. And I'm delighted to welcome, for the first time on State of Play, Tom Christensen, who is the Pritzker Chair in the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department here at CSIS, but also the James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Tom, looking back at 2025, what was the most significant development relating to China in your estimation?
Thanks, Will. It's great to be here. I think the most significant thing that happened was not the truce in the economic conflicts between the United States and China in late October, but the process by which we came to that truce. And I'm afraid that many in China drew the conclusion that China is now very powerful vis-a-vis the United States and backed down the United States by using restrictions on agricultural purchases and on the export of rare earths and rare earth magnets to get the United States back in line. And we've had situations in the past where China became overconfident because of international events. In 2008, the financial crisis caused what I see as Chinese overconfidence. And we had 2 very bad years where China was quite assertive and aggressive toward its neighbors in a destabilizing way for East Asia. So I think that conclusion that China feels very powerful, a lot of Chinese experts see China as very powerful in relation to the United States and its allies and partners in the region, is potentially damaging as we move forward. We already see that not only toward the United States, but we've seen military exercises around Taiwan, and we've seen a lot of pressure on Japan over Taiwan in this week to include restrictions on rare earths and rare earth magnets to Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. So then do you think that confidence, is that going to play into what you expect to see then in this year ahead in 2026? What's your prediction?
It's very likely that national security issues around the world between the 2 powers will lead to a breakdown in the economic truce. And what I think of is we're likely to have lots of differences over issues like Iran, like Russia and Venezuela, that could lead us into a situation where the United States is pressuring China in the economic front. China is pushing back because we know China pushes back. And this whole structure starts to erode or collapse. A few months ago, I was saying that I expected China to try to rebuild Iranian power. China and Iran are very close. China does not like the idea that the Iranian regime is in trouble. Part of that would be to help rebuild the Iranian military. And China could sell, I argued months ago, could sell military-related equipment to Iran to help it rebuild its military power after the strikes from Israel and the United States. If public reports are right, in late November, the United States did intercept a ship going from China to Iran with military-related technologies on it. And that kind of situation could escalate. President Trump likes to use economic pressure as a tool in international politics. We know China pushes back. And I could see something like Iran eroding that truce in the economic relationship. I think President Trump is likely to become increasingly frustrated with President Putin's willingness to reach a peace agreement in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And if he wants to pressure Russia, there's really no better way to pressure Russia than to pressure China to put economic pressure on Russia, because China is such an important economic partner of Russia. And if the United States uses secondary sanctions and those types of tools on China, we know that China will push back. And again, the economic agreement starts to unravel.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you so much for your insights, Tom. Okay, Charlie Edel is a senior advisor and our Australia chair. And Charlie, you cover Australia, New Zealand, and the Southern Pacific more broadly. So in 2025, we had tariffs, aid cuts, questions about the future of AUKUS. What do you think was the most significant development in 2025?
Well, Will, you've basically answered the question for me, but I think I might frame it in a slightly different way by noting that it was the outcome and the results of elections in both the United States and Australia that produced the biggest outcome, the biggest change, I think, that we should see. So obviously, with the Trump administration coming to office in early January, the suite of new policies, the new direction that America First has taken the U.S. with tariffs, with the review of AUKUS that didn't actually end up doing all that much in the wash, that was a huge amount of changes. But you'd have to couple that, I think, with the fact that the Australians had an election in May, and it resulted in a somewhat improbable landslide victory for the current government, which is, again, the new government, reinforcing a lot of their, I think, earlier tendencies. So it was the outcome of both elections that I think produced the biggest events that we saw this past year.
So how about looking forward then? For 2026, what is your boldest prediction for what you expect to see or think might happen in this part of the world?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, Will, and I think I want to mess with your question, if you don't mind too much, which is to say the biggest and the boldest prediction, I think, that would change in many ways the strategic calculus of the region would be if you saw really a ramped up commitment to defense spending by the Australians. There has been change, there has been increases, but they've been somewhat incremental over the last years. So I think a really bold prediction, because there have been many calls by friend and foe alike that the Australians need to get much higher than where they are. The boldest prediction would be for the Australians to do this. Now, what would cause that is the interesting question, because nothing has caused a spike in spending or tension to national security yet. The causes, I don't think, would be secret or hard to predict, but it would involve an external shock that has not yet produced that. And you could see that in anything from potentially a larger Chinese circumnavigation of Australia like they had last year, maybe with an aircraft carrier this time, to something that would be more probable, which would be the Chinese finding purchase in a Pacific island like the Solomon Islands for a dual-use military facility, which is what the Australians, what the Americans have been trying to prevent, or, God forbid, a real-life contingency in the Taiwan Straits. The latter two, I think, would actually produce something of a shock to the system that would cause the outcome of a bold prediction to really spike defense spending.
Okay, Charlie, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Will.
Okay, now we have Dr. Christy Gavella, who is our senior advisor and Japan chair. So moving on to Japan, Christy, what was the most significant development that we saw in Japan last year?
I think there were two things. One was definitely the U.S.-Japan trade deal on the foreign policy end. As with many other countries, tariffs consumed an enormous amount of time and energy for Japan, and basically that was holding everything else hostage in U.S.-Japan relations. Yeah. So once the initial agreement was announced in July, and the details were hammered out a little bit more in September, it really, allowed the U.S. and Japan to get some stability in the relationship and to move forward with other things. And also internationally, it was the really big, first really big trade deal that Trump concluded. So I think it was a big deal not only for Japan, but for a lot of those international trade dynamics. And the second thing, it's been a huge year for Japan in domestic politics. The LDP, their longtime ruling party, lost its majority in both houses of parliament. its 26-year-old coalition with Komeito broke up. But then, out of nowhere, we got a new leader and Japan's first female prime minister, a new coalition partner, Isshin No-kai. And it's a really a pretty dynamic time for Japanese politics in a country where things have been incredibly politically stable for a long time. So my two things.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you. And so then looking ahead, what is your boldest prediction for what you think we might see in Japan or relating to Japan in 2026?
I think 2026 could be a landmark year for Japanese security policy. The new Prime Minister, Sanae Takeichi, is committed to pushing forward with defense reforms. Japan had already committed to a historic increase in defense spending to 2% of GDP, and she's accelerated that commitment. She's also already indicated her intention to revise Japan's 3 strategic documents, which are its national security strategy, its defense strategy, and its defense buildup program, and to ease other rules like on things such as defense exports. And unlike before, the LDP's new coalition partner is actually on board with this general trajectory on security, unlike the old partner, Komeito. So all in all, I think 2026 could be a huge year for Japanese security policy, and the government could take really significant steps, despite having a domestic political situation that's in flux.
Yeah, and it's got off to a bit of a tricky start with tensions in China, but we will look forward, and I hope that you will come back onto State of Play and help us understand some of these security transformations taking place in Japan. So thank you so much, Christy.
Thank you.
Okay, moving back to China now, and Henrietta Levin is a senior fellow with the Freeman Chair on China Studies. Henrietta, what was most significant relating to China in 2025?
Looking at the US-China relationship, I think the most significant moment of 2025 was China's successful wielding of rare earth choke points to get the US to basically back down from the entirety of the trade war and accept a truce on China's terms. China now feels like it is negotiating with the United States as a full-on equal, if not perhaps playing an even stronger hand than the one the United States has on offer. And that's going to change the dynamic of global competition for years and decades to come.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So does that feed into your prediction for 2026, or are you predicting something else relating to China?
Only sort of.
Okay.
So in the US side, you will still see significant tariff barriers vis-a-vis China for the foreseeable future. They're much lower than they were, but they're also higher than they were, depending on where you're starting. This leaves the rest of the world really vulnerable to absorbing all of China's massive overcapacity. So Chinese growth predicated on exporting overcapacity that wipes out industry, wipes out jobs around the world. This problem is only going to get worse in the global south because they don't have those same protective measures. So I think you're going to see countries that have always thought of China as a vehicle of economic growth and opportunity start to see a much more complicated picture, see trade with China actually hurting their domestic industry, and start to enact real protective measures of their own.
Okay, so the global south pushes back against China in 2026, at least on the economic front, on the trade front.
In as narrow a way as they feel they possibly can. But
sure.
I think their space for avoiding the issue is really shrinking in the coming year.
Okay, fascinating. Henrietta, thank you so much for taking part in this and being a good sport.
Thanks so much.
Okay, next up, I am joined by Bonnie Lin, who is a senior advisor and the director of our China Power project. Bonnie, it's so great to have you on State of Play. Thank you. Please, can I start by asking, what was the most significant development in 2025, in your opinion?
Well, I think that's a tough question, but focusing just on internally within China, I would say one of the biggest developments within China was the massive anti-corruption drive that we saw internally within the Chinese state. In 2025, China has put 65 high-level officials within the Chinese government under investigation. And these are all officials at least at the deputy minister level. And this is 12% more than what we saw in 2024, and I believe even more than what we saw in 2023. So this is quite extensive. And that doesn't include the purges of Chinese military officials, which has added another layer of complexity in terms of understanding what's happening internally within China.
Goodness. Okay, I had not been flagging. I had not been tracking that. So thank you for flagging. So then, looking forward about what you're expecting to see in 26, is it tied to that, or do you have another prediction about something else?
So I think I have something else because I wanted to focus on one domestically within China and then one in terms of Chinese foreign policy. And I think, Will, you had asked us to think boldly and maybe put ourselves in relative uncomfortable position.
Please do.
So,
yes.
So I think one possibility is that in 2026, we might see China engage in a potential limited military standoff that could maybe even lead to some limited exchange between China and Japan. We saw particularly later this year, since early November, that China has increased its rhetoric and escalation against Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi after comments that she made in the Japanese Diet about Taiwan. And we haven't seen, it's been 2 months since then, and we haven't seen China indicate that it is satisfied with the Japanese government's explanation of her comments. And just earlier this week, we saw China impose restrictions on dual-use items to Japan, arguing that that will help prevent Japanese militarism. So I worry that that could escalate. And I think there is incentive from China's end to be more cautious on the economic side. But on the military side, in terms of demonstrating its displeasure, I think there is a small risk that we might see more confrontation between Japan and China.
Wow. Okay. Well, you heard it first here. We will watch and see. But Bonnie, thank you so much. And thank you for being bold as well. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Next, we're moving to Africa. And I am delighted to welcome Oge Onubogu, the director and senior fellow in our Africa program. So, Oge, last year we saw a collapse of US foreign assistance, tariffs, tensions with South Africa. In your mind, what was the most significant development on the continent?
Thank you so much, Will. I think to that question, it's really hard to put a finger on one, but whether you talk about tariffs or you talk about immigration or the rift with South Africa or even the engagements with Nigeria, I think just in terms of what we saw as significant on the continent for last year was sort of the election of President Trump in 2024 and the activities that followed his inauguration. If anything, we actually saw a lot of engagement between the US government and different African governments. And I think this also kind of really stood out for a lot of people too as well, of the first year in a US administration for the government to have that level of engagement with different African governments.
So then as we look forward to 2026, what do you predict? What do you think might happen?
In terms of 2026, I think there will be a greater move for many countries to really identify what their interests are. I think there is a tendency sometimes when we talk about Africa or when we want to make these predictions, we have to be clear. It's a continent, 54, 55 different countries.
Sure,
all these different countries all have their own interests. And many of them may not necessarily have sort of the relationships with the US. So what we might see is more African countries diversify their partnerships. We might see middle powers, the Gulf states, play a more visible role with different African states. On the US side, we might actually see the US government make moves to recognize Somaliland. And in recognizing Somaliland, I think that will also raise other conversations and other discussions too as well on the role of the African Union, the role of regional economic bodies. I think 2025 sort of started laying the foundation on what the US's engagement strategy would be in Africa in terms of commercial diplomacy, or in terms of looking at critical minerals. I think as we move into 2026, there will be more even more clarity on that front on how the U.S. Engages on the continent or the areas or sectors that are of interest to the U.S. in terms of its engagement. So I think for me, my hope in 2026 in terms of predictions will be just for more clarity. I think there will be more clarity in the way African governments identify their interest and pick their partners and work with their partners.
Sounds like a big year ahead, and we will look forward to turning to you to help us understand it all. Thank you so much, Oge.
Thank you very much.
Now we're moving further east with Greg Poling, director of our Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Greg, what was the most striking development in your part of the world last year?
So I think the most significant development was actually a region-wide story, which is how much more resilient or how much less affected the region actually was by Trump's tariffs and the trade war. You know, this was the most export-heavy region in the world. All of the predictions from like OECD and others was that places like Vietnam would be hit hardest, even worse than China. And yet Vietnam clocked 8% GDP growth last year, the highest in years. The only countries in the region that really saw their predicted growth before Trump came into office decrease were places like the Philippines. They got battered by natural disasters and corruption. So it's not to say that the tariffs didn't matter, but that they mattered a whole lot less than people expected, partially because American consumers continue to buy things, even if they cost more, and partially because of, I think, very successful efforts at trade diversification, plus efforts to get the Trump administration to cut deals that carved out huge segments of the economy. So the damage from Liberation Day was that, you know, those top line tariffs were never really the tariff rates that anybody faced.
Okay. So looking forward then, what's your boldest prediction for Southeast Asia in 2026?
All right. My boldest prediction is one that I think we'll know in about a month, which is I am unfortunately more than 50% convinced that the Trump administration is going to, if not outright recognize and then engage in some form of rapprochement with the Burmese junta in Myanmar. And this is because we're in the middle of a three-part election right now, a clearly sham election that the junta's holding in the rump state that they still control. The first part was on December 28th. They've got 2 more rounds in January. And while the State Department, I think, continues to say condemn this, and we saw that in a recent statement, Kristi Noem last month used the elections, called them free and fair, and said this is why she was withdrawing temporary protective status from Burmese refugees in the U.S. There's a lot of others in the U.S. government who I think are floating harebrained schemes about accessing rare earths in Myanmar. And so, you know, in an administration that clearly doesn't care that much about democracy and rule of law, I think there's way too much space for entrepreneurs within the regime to come up with reasons that we should engage this sham pseudo-democracy that's going to emerge in about a month.
And what would that actually mean for the US to recognize them?
So it would mean getting into bed with a military government that will have a kind of a sham, a veneer of civilian parties that run things for them, but that only controls on their best day maybe 40% of the country. I mean, this is an active civil war. Min Aung Hlaing today controls less of Myanmar than Bashar al-Assad did of Syria a year ago, and yet we're going to put our bets on this guy to somehow win or to go back to a status quo ante. Any way you slice it, it's a bad bet. It's a bet on a regime that has become an overt proxy of Russia and China, and that isn't going to deliver whatever benefits folks in the Trump administration might expect. And yet for all of that, I suspect that State Department has basically been cut out of decision-making on Burma for the last year. I don't see any reason to think that that's going to change.
Fascinating. Well, sounds like yours might be one of the predictions that we'll know soonest if it was right or not. So thank you for being bold, and we'll report back and see how you did.
All right. I hope I'm wrong.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Will.
Now moving to India and South Asia, and I'm really delighted to have Rick Rosso back on State of Play. As you'll remember, Rick is a senior advisor and holds the chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics in the Economic Security and Technology Department. So Rick, looking back at 2025, what do you think was the most relevant or most important development in South Asia?
Well, it happened very late in the year, but India's getting back to its roots on economic reforms was big news. Part of it driven by wobbliness with the United States and uncertain global trade policy. India knows the growth story really kind of goes down its own roads and pathways. It's up to itself to pick itself up by its bootstraps. And you saw that at the end of the year with some big reforms getting across the finish line.
What kinds of reforms are we talking about?
Biggest ones, I think, is really kind of reconfiguring the national goods and services tax that makes tax compliance a lot easier. But also at the very end of the year, you saw India unleashing the potential for nuclear power by passing a major atomic energy bill, removing foreign investment impediments in sectors like insurance. So some domestic reforms, but also those that are going to help to welcome and warm the environment up for foreign companies to make big investments.
Interesting. So then as you look forward to this year, to 2026, what's your boldest prediction for what you think will happen in India?
I think we wouldn't have considered it bold maybe 8 months ago, but now because things have been stuck at the 1 foot line, the U.S.-India trade agreement. They announced it back in February when you had the big leaders summit. A lot of people poo-pooed at the time, but of course, India has actually become very pro-trade friendly, signing a number of agreements with U.S. partners and allies. So I think we're down to the last mile, which is always the most difficult. Trump pushing for agriculture market access, which India can't go too far on. But I do think we're going to get that across the finish line, which hopefully will right the plane a little bit and get us back on a pretty good trajectory for the broader relationship.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have to report back and see if that comes to pass.
I've been wrong once already on this one, so let's see if I get it right the second time around. I owe one of my colleagues a nickel, so if I could borrow a nickel, by the way, Will, I'd appreciate that.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for taking part. Delighted to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Mona Yacoubian is Senior Advisor and Director of our Middle East program. It has not been a quiet year for the Middle East. What in your mind, was the most significant development in 2025?
I think the most significant development in the Middle East in 2025 was the Israeli strike on Doha in September and all that came after it. I say that because, number one, it really was unprecedented for the Israelis to strike Doha, but also it catalyzed, I think, in a momentous way, movement for what eventually became the Trump 20-point ceasefire in Gaza, which, while very, very shaky, still holds. And by all accounts, the administration is planning to move formally into the second phase of the plan next week.
So then looking forward, what do you think or what is your boldest prediction for what we're likely to see or we could see in the Middle East in 2026?
So I'm going to play on this a little bit, Will, and I'm going to give you 2 predictions.
Great.
For 2026. One that I think has far greater certainty, and not surprisingly, it is also negative. It has to do with war and conflict.
Okay.
The other is a longer shot, more hopeful, and has to do with peace and de-escalation. So I think the more certain prediction, maybe the less bold prediction, is that Israel will initiate a second round of strikes against Iran, maybe sooner rather than later. This comes on the heels of Prime Minister Netanyahu's meeting with President Trump last month in Mar-a-Lago, where it seemed that he perhaps got a green light from Trump to proceed with another round of strikes, given Israel's growing concerns that Iran is rebuilding its ballistic missile program. How this intersects with protests going on and it seemingly expanding in Iran is another question.
Yeah.
But those 2 things could actually dovetail. We'll have to see. The less certain prediction, but the one I really would like to put out there, the hopeful one, is that while it looks like there are renewed tensions building between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, we've also seen the Lebanese government complete the first phase of its 5-phase disarmament plan. And my hopeful prediction is that Lebanon will move significantly toward completion of those other 4 phases in 2026, effectively moving toward the disarmament of Hezbollah.
Wow. And of course, those 2 predictions could intersect with each other as well in an interesting way. So,
Yes.
Okay. Well, Mona, you have given us something an outbreak of new violence and then something to be hopeful for. So we will have to see. We will check back in with you throughout the year as all of this plays out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Will.
So there we have it, 12 predictions from around the world in 2026. And for the sake of fairness, I should say that we recorded most of these the week of January the 5th, and obviously events in Iran and Venezuela and elsewhere are already playing out very quickly. But this is what you heard. On the political side, a transition towards democracy in Venezuela. Viktor Orban in Hungary either loses power or the EU kicks Hungary out. US recognition of the military junta in Myanmar and perhaps of Somaliland as well. Then on the security side, we saw ramped up defense spending, potentially in both Australia and Japan, renewed Israeli strikes on Iran, but progress in the Lebanese government's efforts to disarm Hezbollah, and then potentially China engaging in a military standoff with Japan. We also had some economic predictions. A breakdown in the economic truce between China and the US because of national security issues, a trade deal with India and the US, and then perhaps the global south starting to resist imports from China. A year from now, I'm going to hold them all to account by seeing how they did. But whether they're right or not, it's bound to be another huge year, and we hope that you'll keep listening to State of Play to help make sense of it all. If you're enjoying this podcast, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe, like, or review it. And you can always email me at geopolitics@csis.org with any suggestions or feedback you have. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.